Welcome everyone to our Scholars in the Square lecture for this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown and I am the Director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, tonight's program will unfold as follows. First, our speaker, Jessica. First, our speaker, Jessica Fichtner-Nolin, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then she will engage in a 20-minute period of conversation with Jessica Pratazina, a past CSRS fellow and Toronto-based researcher and advocate whose work focuses on cults and new religious movements, gender-based violence, gender equality, and reproductive justice. Jessica is one of the few scholars globally who studies cults and new religious movements from the perspective of someone who was raised in one herself. Her research explores women's experiences of growing up in and leaving high-control religious groups, and so I think she'll be a really excellent conversation partner for Jess tonight, and she is joining us online from Toronto, so we'll get to that later. So after Jess and Jessica, two Jessicas, which I realized as I was writing my intro yesterday, talk for 20 minutes, I will chair a 20-minute period of open discussion. So our speaker for this evening is Jessica Fichtner-Nolin. Jessica is a master's student in counseling psychology here at UVic and a graduate student fellow at the CSRS this year. Jessica is a researcher dedicated to increasing the well-being of trauma survivors and trauma-exposed therapists through deepening empirical research. Her current research focus is on the intersection of gender identity and experiences of religious trauma and subsequent recovery, on which she will present tonight. Her aim for future work is to develop materials which contribute to clinical competency in the area of religious trauma and recovery. Now, Jess's work on religious trauma, recovery, and centering voices through listening to stories reminds us of the importance of creating spaces for active listening. Truth, reconciliation, and recovery are only possible when we first listen, a lesson we need to take seriously when reflecting on the legacy of the trauma of colonization for Indigenous communities. And so knowing that, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees, and Wisconsin Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Jessica.
Thank you for that land acknowledgement, Rachel. And I think it's just so important to hold in our minds as we approach the subject of religious trauma that the reason that many of us are here is very deeply related to both historical and ongoing religious and spiritual trauma. Okay, so, this isn't working. Okay, yeah, so to start, I just want to continue introducing myself a little bit. As Rachel said, I am a third-year graduate student doing my master's in counseling psych here at UVic. And through both my studies and community work, I've become deeply interested in trauma and how it affects the brain, our bodies, and behaviors, as well as how to alleviate it. So when I began to hear about religious trauma, I became curious about how religion, something that is that many people still consider a source of community and resilience, and something that's certainly been ubiquitous in my life as I was raised within evangelical Christianity, can actually cause pain, harm, and in some cases trauma. And as I've gotten into the research, I've found that religious trauma is something that has a very small body of literature relatively, and few resources for clinicians such as myself that hope to become competent in this area. So this is why I've chosen to study religious trauma and recovery as the focus for my master's thesis. So yeah, my current study is about experiences of religious trauma and recovery for people socialized as women within the context of Christianity. And tonight for this presentation, I'll first briefly introduce the concept of religious trauma, and then describe a little bit of my research design, and then present some of the preliminary findings in the voices of many of my participants. So let's see, this is working now, awesome. So what is religious trauma? So I'll start with a simple but neurological definition of trauma itself. So we all deal with stressors all the time, every day. We might get a little bit anxious or nervous about something, and then eventually return to our sort of normal baseline. Trauma, however, is when the nervous system's response to an inordinately high degree stressor or set of stressors overwhelms one's normal self-regulatory abilities, such that they can't fully return to that restful baseline, which, since we're not designed to be escalated all the time, has various severe psychophysiological consequences. Religious trauma then is when those traumatic stressors occur within a religious context, be that one's church, their family, or another group related to religious practice. And I think it's also important to note that when I say high degree stressor, that's actually a very subjective level of stress. You know, two people can experience the exact same event and react completely differently to it, depending on many factors, including, you know, age, previous experience, past trauma, you know, how stressed you are that day, and access to basic resources, et cetera, list goes on. But I think it's super important to keep this in mind when it comes to religious experiences, that, you know, the sermon that's fine for you might not be fine for another person. As well, religious trauma can result from a single incident of harm, but some scholars suggest that it's more often gradually accrued through exposure to many religious stressors over a period of time. A lot more like complex or repeated trauma, where this accumulation of chronic stress can lead to a sort of chronically dysregulated nervous system. Impacts can include various mental and physical health concerns, including depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsions, panic attacks, suicidality, sexual dysfunction, eating disorders, sleep issues, social isolation, existential or spiritual crisis, and the phenomenon of religious residue, which is when unhealthy or unhelpful ways of thinking that have been shaped by religion can last long beyond someone actually believes them or participates in that religion. Something like this might be a lingering fear of hell or being left behind in the rapture long after they identify as a Christian. I do want to say a little bit about my method because it's kind of fun. So I chose to use Listening Guide for this study. It was developed by Lynn McHale Brown and Kayla Gilligan for qualitative psychological research. And it's found to be especially useful across power imbalances and especially for sensitive issues. So this approach involves conducting free-flowing interviews and then analyzing them through this multi-step listening process to identify the polyphony of voices that can be heard both within and across participants' responses. The relationships between these voices, whether they're harmonious, dissonant, or even silent, is where we can get a sense of the embodied and relational phenomenon that's being studied. Again, I won't get too in depth about it here, but I do want to mention the second step that you can see on the slide there, which involves listening for the I voice or the voice of the self-concept, and then composing I poems using the statements I and then the verb in that sentence, well, any other descriptive words, as I hope to read an I poem for you by the end of this presentation. So over this past summer, I recruited 8 participants from across Canada and conducted semi-structured interviews over Zoom. These were all people who experienced religious trauma as women within Christianity and exhibited signs of recovery, which we then confirmed through screening interviews. Since the question of intersectional identity is relevant to the study topic, I will briefly outline some of the demographic pieces that became relevant within their experiences of religious trauma and recovery. So out of the 8 people in my study, 6 are from BC and 2 are from Alberta. However, their experiences occurred all across Canada, including Eastern Canadian provinces, some in the US, and some overseas. 4 of the participants are queer and 4 are heterosexual. 2 are either non-binary or genderqueer, and the rest continue to identify as women. One of the participants is a single mother and another is in a non-monogamous marriage. Again, I mention these pieces because they did become relevant within their narratives. All of my participants are white, although one maintains both familial and professional ties to the Indigenous community. Interesting to note, I think, is the fact that the experiences of religious trauma for each participant occurred in diverse Christian settings and denominations, from the ultra-conservative and fundamentalist communities where you might expect it, to ones that would consider themselves more centrist, and even to those that are more liberal and progressive leaning. As well, for 2 of the participants, pursuing a vocational call to church leadership did contribute significantly to their experience of religious trauma. And lastly, I'll just note that 4 of the participants are now a-religious, not practicing any formal form of religion, and 4 still identify as practicing Christians. So getting into the voices. Before I get into the results, though, I do want to note that the analysis is still currently underway, and any findings that I present here are preliminary. As well, each of the participants in this study has obviously a unique story, and I honestly wish I could do a case study on each one of them. But I mention this so it becomes explicit that I'm not trying to provide a full scope of every person's experience of religious trauma and recovery. I will, however, present some of the voices that can be heard across the narratives and how they relate to one another in a way that builds out a picture of religious trauma and recovery. So first, I would like to introduce 3 of the important voices that can be heard in many participants' experiences of religious trauma. These are the voice of identification, voice of self-dissociation, and the voice of disconnect. Voice of identification is one that describes the requirements of identifying as a Christian, what behaviors and beliefs are acceptable to remain in good standing with the group and with God. The voice of self-dissociation describes the often kind of covert pressure to abandon parts of the self wherever they might conflict with requirements or norms of identification. This can look like something like praying the gay away or trying to adopt a complementarian relationship pattern when that doesn't actually fit your relationship style. And finally, the voice of disconnect speaks to the loss of group membership, whether chosen or enforced. That is the alternative to self-dissociation, wherever embodied identity and identification are in conflict. If that was hard to follow, I have a little diagram here, excuse the aesthetic, but it does show the relationship between the voices that I described, where you can see that the felt sense of self, which is the blue circle, embodied knowing, and where it conflicts with the voice of identification, where they become dissonant, it forces a move toward either self-dissociation or group disconnect in order to resolve that dissonance. So choosing self-dissociation, I think, is not actually a very active cognitive process. I think it's more instinctual to avoid abandonment, since it then allows someone to continue identifying with the group. So I think also this process of self-dissociation is often helped along by the ingrained theologies that might already be there, which associate sort of holiness with self-denial or the spiritual bypassing of emotions, and certain other things in life. But some scholars suggest that the equation of self-denial and godliness is something that, or was one of the main things that makes religious trauma so very powerful. As it sets up this cycle of dissociating from self to then associate with God. And the danger of that is the more dissociated you are from yourself and from your body, the more vulnerable you become to exploitative dynamics or relationships, whether religious or otherwise. And there's so much more I could say about each of these, but I'll let the participants tell you in their own words. I've really focused in on this voice of self-dissociation, as it's got some pretty concrete analogs in the complex trauma literature. But these quotes here will hopefully help to give us all a sense of what self-dissociation is and why it's so detrimental. Quote, "It's always been very ingrained in me not to trust myself, and I 100% blame religion for that, where you trust the people above you more than yourself." End quote, Lydia. Quote, "I got to a point where I felt like my body was just a vessel for God, and so that anything that was different or unique about me was kind of bad." End quote, Lizzie. Quote, "Purity culture, you need to keep your husband happy. So I said yes, even though I wasn't comfortable." End quote, Amanda. Quote, "I saw me as a faith mechanism, and that faith mechanism was my person." End quote, Lane. So as we sit with these voices, it kind of starts to illustrate an aspect of how religious identification can impact participants' autonomy, agency, and authenticity, each of which are so important for psychological health and resilience. The voice of disconnect. So this is, this is the embodied experience of deep relational and often spiritual disconnect that comes with becoming an outsider to one's religious community, denomination, or faith altogether. So for some, it's a main feature of their trauma. Bree, whose denomination became hostile to her authentic progressive faith journey while pursuing ordination as a minister, says, I'm looking around the room and I'm going, none of these people actually care about me, my life, my career, my ability to provide for my family, my participation, my belonging here. They care more about their dogma. End quote. For many, disconnect is directly related to beginning to embrace one's authentic identity and recovery path, which is highly evident in many narratives, but especially with my queer participants. Lydia, a lesbian, says, quote, my brother wouldn't let me hang out with my nephew alone because they were afraid I was going to turn him gay. I feel like I've lost my family, and I also feel like I've lost the church community that I grew up with. The response of the community has a huge influence on how trauma affects any person, and an unsupportive or blaming response to allegations of mistreatment was part of many participants' stories. Like Teresa, who says, I was at this church that took the side of the organization where I was harmed. In their minds, everything here is good. You are the problem, end quote. Voices of religious trauma are often misunderstood, disbelieved, and silenced, leading to a sense of loneliness, alienation, and isolation. Described here by Lizzie, quote, I don't have anybody else who is going through the same experiences, so I don't really know what is normal to feel, end quote. So from each of these participants, we can hear that the social and spiritual wounding that is often a large part of religious trauma becomes understandable why it might seem easier to try and dissociate from self, or at least try to for as long as possible, than to risk disconnect from the group. Turning toward recovery, the main vocal relationship that I've been hearing among these interviews is the interplay of the voice of self-knowing, voice of connection, and the voice of wonder. And this is quite a harmonious relationship between all three. So self-knowing speaks to growing in a sense of agency, authenticity, and coming to know oneself in an embodied way. A lot of participants speak to learning to heal their nervous system, taking time off work, spending time in nature, or unfolding parts of themselves that were there all along but weren't given permission to emerge. The voice of connection speaks to life-giving relationships congruent with this emerging sense of self. Sometimes this looks like finding others who've been through the same thing. For example, finding other women or other queer folks who've been marginalized by the church, or finding a therapist or spiritual director that can validate both the religion and the harm it caused. Connections, though, like this can be really difficult to find, and some in my study have found connections parasocially through content creators, authors, and podcasters even, who spoke about religious trauma or deconstruction. Others still have found validation historically through researching the church's persecution of women during historical witch trials. And I find that this connective and communal voice is so heavily supported within the complex trauma literature as something that is integral to rebuilding a survivor's sense of a meaningful world after trauma. Lastly, the voice of wonder. This one speaks to developing comfort with uncertainty, mystery, and curiosity, an ability to hold opposing ideas at the same time, whether theological or within one's own identity. I think that this makes so much sense that it would be important and very present when being certain of things, whether that's God or theology, or how to signal that I'm a believer to everyone else around, was for some a huge part of their trauma. And once again, I'll let the participants tell you about these voices and how they relate to each other. So self-knowing and connection are often found together in harmony. These two quotes from Lane and Teresa illustrate this brilliant interplay here. Quote, when I unwind from this toxic spirituality, toxic religion, I'm a less insecure person. And when I'm less insecure, I'm so much more loving and able to focus on other people. And I guess part of my hope is in that too, that it becomes less and less about working that out and more about all the other things that I could be spending my energy on, cultivating the person that I want to be, end quote, Lane. Quote, I feel like I've got much more defined boundaries in myself as well, that, yes, I will be part of this community, but no, I won't do this, this, and this, end quote, Teresa. Yeah, the voice of wonder. So once again, this speaks to the cultivation of a new relationship with uncertainty, change, and mystery, especially around identity and spirituality or faith. Quote, I feel sort of this lightness and levity to just play with spirituality, to connect with what in me connects to those things, and to just seek God or whatever I want to call it in that moment, in there, end quote. Lane. Quote, I feel like I'm starting a new puberty. I feel like I'm in a new age of discovery post-Christianity, being able to let myself explore and be wrong, explore and continue changing, end quote, Lizzie. Quote, I don't care anymore about being a heretic. I'm just like, I don't care what I believe. God is good. He loves me. I will get the beliefs wrong my whole life, just like everyone else, and that's okay, end quote, Melissa. Quote, having permission to review my inherited theology with the lens of, is this life-limiting or life-giving? That invitation has been huge for me, end quote, Bree. So we can see how the voice of wonder indicates a process where participants are building and expanding rather than dogmatic sense of self and the world through the recovery process. And lastly, so here, just to illustrate the confluence of self-knowing and wonder that come together in so many of the healing narratives, I want to present Jolie's I poem, since I poems have a way of evoking a sense of a person's psychological logic, or to maybe make you feel a little bit of how they experience the world. And I'll read that poem in a moment, but I also just want to draw attention to the piece of art that Jolie created and shared with me during our interview. So she's someone who continues to practice Christianity and has been pursuing the role of minister as a vocational calling. But part of her story includes church policy enforcement that made her feel alienated as a woman in leadership, as a single mother of an Indigenous daughter, as a neurodiverse person, and an advocate for LGBTQ2S+ rights. So this piece is representative of a faith that's expansive for all parts of herself and all parts of other people, which is also illustrated here in her I poem, which I'll read now. I feel a comfort. I'm tethered. I'm kind of shape-shifting who I am. I thought I knew. I didn't know. I was really trying to fit. I'll be honest. I was really trying. If I dressed a certain way, if I do these certain things, you can ignore the fact I'm a single mom. Now I'm like, no, I am a single mom. I do have ADHD. I have chronic fatigue. I don't know. Starting with, I feel a comfort in being tethered, and then ending on the I don't know, just so highlights this freedom to wonder who oneself might be without the oppressive scripts that she's inherited, which I think is so highly illustrative of the ongoing and cyclical journey of recovery from religious trauma. So I'll just end there for today.
Wonderful. So we're just gonna get Jessica up on the screen. Hopefully. Refresh it. There we go. Now we can see you in the room, Jessica. So wonderful. Now I'll turn it over to the two of you to have a conversation.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that talk. It brought so many things to mind about the things that I've been working on for the last sort of 10 years. And we had this great conversation earlier. There's just so much rich connection between what we do. And I loved your take on it, especially as a practitioner and someone who put something out into the world that helpers of any variety can use when they're working with people who express religious trauma. So thank you. That was awesome. So, one thing I wanted to start talking about that might serve as a clarifying question for people who don't kind of come from the social work psychology background. You mentioned complex trauma. And I think many times when people hear the word trauma, they think sort of a PTSD, like a single event that is experienced as traumatic. Could you tell us more about what complex trauma means?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. yeah, so again, as you mentioned, we might think of trauma as something that, there's a really dramatic, scary event and something probably life-threatening, very shocking, or witnessing that happening to somebody else, and you get the re-experiencing, the being really jumpy, what we call hypervigilance, all of these pieces. It's all very much based in literature around combat trauma and accidents and things like that. And but what sort of emerged over the years that trauma has been researched is that there is a sort of another kind of subset of trauma where it's kind of a bit more of a slow burn or a slow build, and often due to existing within an environment or system or relationship where you're under constant levels of stress, and that can build and build and build with little chance of reprieve or escape. And that creates all of the symptoms that I just spoke about, plus a bit more ability or like a hard time holding meaningful relationships, attaching to people, because there is this sort of often relational aspect to complex trauma. And as the name says, it does create a more complex presentation, often more long lasting. And so it's really kind of shaping up to seem like, yes, there are examples of religious trauma that would be sort of the more classic PTSD, incidental, like traumatic in any setting kinds of things. But then there are also the more ideological aspects that can be just as harmful, if not more. I'm thinking of Linda K. Klein's work around purity culture, where it's kind of come to the surface that a young woman raised within purity culture, being like sort of this chastity focused, sexual purity, saving yourself for marriage kind of thing, and modesty is a big part of that, can exhibit similar, like the same symptoms as a survivor of sexual assault, even if they have not been assaulted. So yeah, there's something really both aligned and more, I think, even more expansive with the religious aspect of religious trauma. So yeah, thank you for that question.
In hearing you talk just now, I was reminded of the theory of ambivalent sexism. So we have hostile sexism on the one hand, and we have what gets called benevolent sexism on the other, which is a sexism that's often veiled as like chivalry. Kind caring for women because certainly they couldn't care for themselves, and that I think comes across very clear in purity culture. We're doing this for your own best interests, right? Because you're so precious. Your sexuality or virginity or gender is so precious that we have all these things around. So
totally.
Yeah. The participants in your study, I think you said half of them identified as genderqueer or non-binary, and the other half are women. And especially because I do so much of my work around gender violence, I'd be curious to know if you brought any kind of gendered lens to your analysis or what's happening with that piece.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a huge part of my research. As I left a lot of the nerdy bits out, or nerdier pieces, but I do kind of base my methodology in feminist phenomenology. And so then the aspects of gender and power are really central to the way that I am looking at this. Gender, power, and embodiment as well. And so it's just becomes so like blatantly clear, at least to me and how I'm looking at this, that people's experiences of religion and trauma are very gendered, and it has to do so much with who has power and like who's allowed to inhabit those positions, or who shapes even the theology or the ways we interpret scripture. And then that trickles down to whose voices do we hear, who do we believe. And as I said, for so many of the participants, even if they do like have the courage to voice what's happened to them, then the not being believed is just like sometimes the bigger nail in the coffin there. It also kind of highlights for me, again, with the sort of intersectional piece, if we're going to go, intersectional feminist theory, that people with multiple less empowered identities are more likely to experience any kind of trauma, and especially religious trauma, which is, again, fairly obvious with my queer participants, where like we've got the multiple less empowered identities that are explicitly disempowered through theology there. But then I've also had other participants talk about things like, being in a mission organization where there's a very explicit power hierarchy with white men at the top, then married women can be they can have a little bit of power. Single women are down below, which is the space that she inhabited, and that really contributed to her experience of trauma. And then, you've got the men and women of color, men and women who aren't English speakers down at the bottom. And then it also actually really does impact even vicarious trauma as well, like with my participant who isn't Indigenous herself, but, is very enmeshed in the Indigenous community. A lot of the sort of accumulated stressors that sort of stacked up, not all of them were sort of explicitly religious. Some of them were a bit more influenced by her Indigenous connections in that, like, we've got forest fires decimating mostly Indigenous communities, and that would affect all of the people around her. We've got, the discoveries at residential schools, and that affected all the people around her and some of her relatives. And so then, the religious piece was the straw that broke the camel's back. And as well as her own experiences of trying to pursue leadership as a woman. So it's the intersections go very deep. Gender is just a kind of a gateway into, like, what can we see in this? So thanks for that question.
Overlapping and interlocking intersectional pieces that build on one another. And before we leave the nerdiness, I just had to say I'm so glad that you are using the listening guide. I'm so happy to see people taking up the listening guide and that you read that poem at the end. I find that phase of analysis where you do the I poems is so amazing and powerful. Thank you. So I think you touched on this a little bit, but I'm fascinated by religious residue, which I hadn't heard of until you brought it up. Could you say a little bit more about what that means and maybe tie it into how that impacts their experiences of faith and religious community now for your participants?
Yeah, totally. Religious residue is really fascinating. And it's something that it absolutely does affect how people believe, but also like it is also kind of separate. Like I think where I've seen it like very blatantly mentioned as harmful is with people who were like raised in Christianity from a young age. And so it's very deeply informed their like sense of self, sense of the world, and often, fears. Like kids in religion are often exposed to these big ideas, these existential ideas about like eternity and afterlife, maybe before they're developmentally like ready for that, or it's developmentally appropriate, and that in itself can be part of the trauma. And so then, like it was very explicitly mentioned by one of my participants who doesn't identify as a Christian anymore, 100% doesn't believe that there's like a literal hell that certain people are going to and some people are not. But and this person as well, it was really related to their queer identity of like what, like just this lingering fear of like, what if I have gotten it wrong, and like what if I am going to hell because of who I am, even though they really don't believe that cognitively anymore. It's just on a embodied level, and that's something they're really still trying to work at disentangling and working through. And I think that speaks to how the recovery process is so it's long and it's cyclical, and depending on who you ask, it's lifelong. It's not a return to previous levels of functioning. It's a creating a new self. But I hope I answered your question about religious residue specifically.
You did, and I think that at the end you hinted towards this. It's not a going back; it's like an expansion. It's a moving into that wonder phase. Like, what if our doubts become this? Like I remember feeling like, oh my God, like anything could be possible. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Then it can be like, oh my God, anything could be possible, right?
Exactly.
shift. Yeah. I think that
Yeah.
that's a nice segue into talking about, since we're both sort of scholar practitioners, talking a little bit more about the practice side of this. Um, what do you, I'm not asking you to speak for your participants, but from the time spent with them, what do you think they might wish other people who don't share this experience? What do you think they might wish they would understand better about religious trauma and what that means?
Like people in general or practitioners specifically?
I think people broad, let's start broad and just say people in
Okay. Yeah. I think just the idea that that like two people can have such very different experiences of the same thing. I mentioned it in the presentation, but I think that's such an important thing to hold, and that carries with it a lot of openness to, you know, someone else's experience that might not reflect your own. And again, like everybody's got their own views on whether religion is helpful or harmful, including therapists. And that's something that did come up with, if I did ask about therapy, things that were unhelpful within that are like if people are either like way too like overtly like, oh yeah, religion is bad, or way too overtly like unable to criticize it because they're too connected to it. So I think anybody who has someone in their life that has experienced religious trauma can benefit from just this, just like learning to actually listen and hear and not necessarily like have some awareness of what it brings up for you and maybe what you might think of religion, whether good or bad. And yeah, I love Shelley Rambo's concept of bearing witness. And so it's this idea that like you are bearing witness to the change or the recovery or the rebuilding of self instead of trying to cause it or create it, whether you're a friend or a clergy member or a counseling practitioner. You're there for it. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you're highlighting the diversity, the range of diversity of experiences people can have, not just within the same religious community, especially based on, you know, your intersectional social positionality within that community, that we can experience the same thing and come away with a very different, like the event itself is not the trauma, it's the way it's experienced by the person. And I think when we're in the process of analysis, data analysis, where I have this habit of always wanting to look for themes that are common among everybody. And I think you did such a beautiful job of allowing for that that variety and diversity. So broadening out the last question a little bit. So let's say you're speaking like really specifically to helpers, if they're psychologists, social workers, clergy people, and they're working with someone who expresses religious trauma. If you had to pick two things that you want to tell them about how they can ground their work, what would your two picks be?
Ooh, two things. Oh, that's huge. Okay, so the first thing, like right off the top of my head, is just having a consciousness and an awareness of how a person who's, you know, possibly been raised in Christianity or has religious trauma might relate to authority. Mm-hmm. This is something that came up for several of my participants in kind of the same vein as religious residue of like, okay, like I'm meeting with a psychiatrist today. He's a man, he's older than me, he's powerful. I'm having a panic attack. Like, so this person that's like, you know, meant to be helping this person is all of a sudden now put in this position where like they could very easily sort of re-traumatize, even just by accident. So just trying to have an awareness of how that view of authority might be expressed in the relationship or in the helping relationship, and what you might be able to do to kind of acknowledge it and work maybe with that as well. And the other thing is like, what is your, like, what does recovery mean? Talking about healing or recovery for someone who potentially part of the trauma has been being told that they're inherently broken, inherently sinful, inherently in need of God's intervention to become whole or become good, is like, it's again, very high risk of re-traumatization. If you're someone who's like, now I'm the helper, I'm going to help you recover, I'm going to help fix you, or like, even if you don't like try to come across that way, that can very much be in the room and in the relationship. And so, yeah, once again, it just comes back to the idea of like, how do you just be with someone in that process rather than trying to change them? So yeah, the relational aspect is so important. Yeah.
And I think not assuming that you as the helper have a predetermined point of what you use the word recovery, but recovery looks like.
Yeah.
It's going to look like this. You're going to believe this way, or you're going to feel this way about your experience.
Totally. You're going to be fine to go back to church again when you're recovered. Heck no, that's not the standard. Some people might be.
Yes.
But yeah, that's not necessarily the indicator or the goal, or yeah.
So, all right. Well, do you have one more quick question, or can we open up to the room?
That's a very quick one.
Okay.
I just want to know, what is your hope? What's your hope for your participants? Like you spend so much time with these people and their narratives, and you feel like you know them and have this relationship with them. What's your hope?
I have so many hopes for them. Like, as I, spend time with them in their transcripts or whatever, I'm just very inspired by they bring up things like generativity and using their experiences to make other people's lives better. A lot of them want to be counselors, some are teachers, clergy members. And so I'm so hopeful that within this lifelong recovery process, they'll be able to extend that so far beyond them and into their communities as well. So yeah, that's what I hope for them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jess. We'll open it up to the room now to a broader conversation. We can start actually going right online since we have a couple in line there.
Sure. Ava asks, how is religious trauma self-dissociation distinct from that of anyone experiencing indoctrination in any sort of power hierarchy?
That's a great question. I think there's definite parallels, but the thing that keeps coming back within like the religious aspect of any of like, why is the religious part of this important, is because there are such like heavy, concrete and exclusive claims, morality claims to afterlife, exclusive truth, like all of these things. So the stakes just get so much higher than they would say in like a very strictly hierarchical like business setting or something like that. And so like there's definite parallels that can be drawn in many directions, but that's what I keep coming back to with that.
Yeah, Matt.
Thanks very much, Jess. So I'm wondering if you came across in any of your participants a differentiation in their experiences with, say, certain church leaders, friends within the community, let's say a parent or a family member, where there was that kind of divergence, some good over here, some bad over here, or was it just monstrosity across the board? All the way down?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, actually, because it really just alludes to the fact that it's so, the good and the bad are so entangled with this. And I think that's part of why it can be so difficult to sort through, and you have to just make it so minute to actually work through it. Because yeah, like some people still have, Christian friends, still going to the same church. Some people have family members that like at first were really like oppositional, but then came around. So yeah, like it's just, I would never paint any of it with a whole cloth, like anything. But yeah, it's very enmeshed. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, back to Zoom.
Sure. Angie asks, Jess, the title of your lecture is Unsilencing Voices. What advice would you give as a starting point for people looking to break the silence, to find their voice in community, family, and relationships, or to become a voice to advocate for others who are still silent? Maybe an opening statement to start off a conversation, or a good topic to start a conversation with loved ones to slowly broach the subject.
Oof. Thank you for that. It's so That's a huge question, and I think it's so important. I think honestly, even like prior to the starting of the conversation, I think just finding the points that are settled within yourself enough to be exposed to the outside I think is a huge starting point. And then when you do find those points and say like maybe they come up in conversation, being able to check in with yourself and be like, okay, am I feeling grounded enough to actually start, this conversation, no matter where it's going to go? Because once it's out there, it's out there. And it's I think the healing that can happen from having those conversations is more for you than for changing the minds of others. And I think that's very important to hold. So as far as like a opening statement, I'm kind of drawing a blank right now, but I think keeping things to your experience rather than like and really couching it in that, like, I know maybe this thing is good for you, or I understand that you think this way, but for me, this is how it's impacted me. So that's pretty basic, but that's all I got right now.
Thanks, Angie.
Yeah.
Hi, Jess.
Hello.
Between your participants, was there any link as to the point where they realized that they were struggling with religious trauma? Especially as with complex trauma, oftentimes it's somebody who, like if it's a parent, for example, it's somebody you trust and you want to trust in it. So having that realization is a big deal.
Huge.
And then with the church, with God, the trust there, at what point can they, was there a link between the point that they all were like, whoa, okay, this is a struggle?
Yeah, that's one of the things that was really different across the study. One, if I could generalize at all, one thing that I've noticed is like, if it's a matter of self-dissociation to try and like stay in the group, what comes up is the voice of the body. Body's not happy about having to push all this stuff down. And so for some people, it's realizing, whoa, I'm having a panic attack when I'm trying to go to church, or like something like that. And there's maybe something here. Sometimes it's obvious of like, oh, this person who's my boss in this religious setting is very verbally abusive. Like sometimes it's unignorable. And then that kind of forces them to reckon with all of the other stuff that they've kind of been co-signing for their whole life. And then some people, it is a choice of like, maybe there's been like less of the self-dissociation, and then this big kind of event of public bullying comes up because their personal theology doesn't match the theology of this denomination. And it's a very, overt realization that like, I am not, like my authentic spiritual journey isn't welcome here anymore. So it's very different across the board, but there are a few things that I can kind of point to there. Yeah, thanks, Laura.
Scott, back to Zoom. Yep,
Okay.
please.
Joel says, one, for your interviewees who continue to identify as Christian, what did they reveal about why they continue to do so? And two, did any interviewees change their Christian social networks, for example, from conservative to more progressive social ties, in order to help them do so?
Yeah, basically everyone did kind of change their social ties or denominational ties, I guess. There's a very, at least, within the people in my study, very overt expansion of going from, more conservative to more progressive, if possible. And yeah, the people who do continue to identify as Christians, it's like they really do hold that sort of mystery piece too, of like, I can be in the same room as a person, like I could be a gay Christian in the same room as somebody, or working in the same place as a Christian who like thinks that I am an abomination, and that's okay with me. I can actually hold that. Like, wow, I can't imagine having that much like grace or whatever you want to call it. And then some people see it as like a spiritual maturation process as well, where like this journey toward uncertainty is like, part of them like authentically living out their, like just what feels congruent to them. So I hope that answers the question. It's just, it's again, a very individual thing. Yeah.
It's religious trauma. Religion is a broad word. My own experience with it is literalist, biblical literalist Christianity. And I get all of that on a gut level at age 80. What about other religions? I mean, there's Buddhism, there's Islam, there's Judaism, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am not as deep in that literature, but it is something that is found in like diverse religions across the globe, like from the monotheistic religions. Basically, all of them have examples of religious trauma, as well as non-theistic, sort of more spirituality groups. I have seen some papers on like spiritual trauma within Buddhism. I would say, like, depending on the belief, it would then become more spiritual trauma instead of religious trauma if it's not an actual religion. Some people like conflate the two. Some people say religious and spiritual trauma. I generally view religious trauma as a subset of spiritual trauma. And so that can happen in any kind of group. Well, I mean, I think it can happen in any experience of trauma, no matter what it is, but especially if it's happening in a relationship that does have some bearing on your spirituality. So it is found pretty globally.
Yeah, Rory?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I had a bit of a fundamentalist era when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and probably experienced some of the things that you pointed to. We didn't have a language for it. Oh, yeah, that's really helpful to have that language. But that brings me to the question of life stage. I wonder if you found anything on life stage, because for me, it was very much a young adult looking for identity, looking for community, and having certain groups being all too ready to offer you those things, right? And so having a certain vulnerability, I think, to experiencing religious trauma at that kind of turning point in one's life. Did you notice any life stage stuff in your?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. Like, even for the people that were like raised within Christianity, some really kind of pivotal pieces happened in those kind of like expansion, identity, but finding stages of life where they're all of a sudden at this mission school that is like making them work 80 hours a week and just like disconnecting them from their family and like all of these things, and they're ready to like soak it all up because like, okay, I'm here, I'm going to be devoted, I'm going to like surrender to the process, and that is so vulnerable. There's definitely some life stage stuff, and as well within the recovery too, because I think it kind of speaks to this sort of spiritual maturation way of some people have made sense of it, of like, I don't know if anyone is like familiar with Richard Rohr's kind of movement through simplicity, complexity, perplexity. I'm getting it all wrong, but just ending in that sort of spiritual posture.
Great. So there's another question online.
Yes. Chris says, this was a really fascinating presentation. Many thanks. I find that I've been sitting here pondering your answer to an earlier question about the distinguishing features of the trauma that comes from Christianity. You mentioned that it's about the magnitude and power of absolute claims, for example, one truth, hell, etc. This seems plausible to me. All of these seem terrifying to me too. I wonder whether this leads you to make any claims about whether monotheistic religions are unusually prone to causing trauma. This was written before you answered the last question. Partially addressed it.
Yeah, I don't know that I would want to make those claims. I think that any group that has some charismatic figures and some power hierarchy can be maybe not equally traumatic, but this is a question that like I've maybe brushed past, and I don't really want to look at it too closely, but it's a great question, and I do plan to look at it a little bit more, and I'm open to people's thoughts on it for sure.
Yeah, Jess.
Thank you, Jessica. Say more about wonder. Like, what a wonderful thing to show up on the slide. And when I think about defining spirituality versus religion, connection and wonder are kind of central to my ideas around it. So if wonder is a sign of recovery, is the lack of wonder a diagnostic tool?
I mean, it can be. It could be like when you're in survival mode, you have to be quite certain about what's going to get you through the day. You don't have a ton of leeway to be like okay with the mysteries of life, you know. And I think it is both a characteristic of like certainty is a characteristic of dogma, you know, and you can be dogmatic in any direction. And so I think some people who are less recovered then, you know, shift their body weight to the more progressive side, but are just as dogmatic about it. And I would say that is maybe not a diagnostic criteria, but something that would indicate that, oh, there's something that we need to work through there. Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, Megan.
Thank you very much. That was great. I had a question around motherhood, if that came up for any of your participants. That when I was listening to you, it seemed to me that a lot of these traumas happened during childhood when the developmental stage is just to accept these beliefs without questioning it, and that's part of the terror. And I was wondering if any of the participants experienced motherhood where they switched roles and they were the caregiving role, they were the person who was maybe explaining belief systems, whether that was a healing or recovery tool, or if that had anything to do with their process. And also it struck me that your final stage wonder was a return to childhood, the curiosity, the questioning, that's like having another childhood.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, one of the participants said it's like a second puberty too. Like it does speak to that. But yeah, only 2 of my participants were mothers. And one of them, you know, wasn't raised in the church, wasn't raising her daughter as a Christian. So not quite in as direct of a sort of relationship as you mentioned there, though I wonder about that too. But oh yeah, one of the participants specifically motherhood, specifically matrescence and being pregnant and then giving birth and then having a small child, really opened her up to a more embodied form of spirituality and Christianity for her. She's one who continues to identify as a Christian. And that I think has been super protective for her actually, of like having this like religion that is expansive enough for, you know, physicality and embodiment. And yeah, I think it served her very well. And that actually kind of maybe not is the thing that set her on this progressive faith journey, but it definitely really, I don't know, but yeah, kicked it off, but has helped it along, I think. So thank you for that question.
Yeah.
So one of the themes I noticed in your talk seemed to be like battling with patriarchy, and like the rationality, rigidity, a sort of historicizing that, like, you know, it's like the religion projects itself backwards and forwards in time, in the beginning and in the end, and like, yeah, there's no like real like in out of that. And just in terms of like, and your reply to the, like, you know, you talk about returning to a sense of wonder, that seems to be like an opt out to like get out of like a rational patriarchal encapsulation.
Yeah, that's definitely connected to it, I would say. Because yeah, where we have these like prescriptive, very restrictive roles, it's like, okay, well, that might have served me for a bit, but what else is possible? And when you don't have, again, yeah, it starts as really scary possibly, but then there can be a sense of comfort in there too. And yeah, it is when we don't have those scripts, what happens? And that's huge in the recovery process and in life, I think. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. please join us next week, same time, same place, for Suad Ahmed, who will be talking about Through Our Eyes, the social and emotional lives of Somali Muslim youth. So please join us next week for that lecture. Thanks again, Jeff.
Yeah.